Hi, everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Nikolai Minchev. I'm a principal research fellow at the IGP. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this week's Soundbite, which is part of the continuing Spring 2025 series entitled Political Turning Points 2024-2025, Causes, Consequences, and Solutions. Today, we're very delighted to welcome to the IGP Kathy Beach. Kathy is the director and co-founder of the Center for Collective Intelligence Design at Nesta, which explores how human and machine intelligence can be combined to develop innovative solutions to social challenges. Kathy was the lead author of the Collective Intelligence Design Playbook and leads the center's partnership with UNDP and the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies, Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. She also oversees the center's grants program, which has supported 30 different experiments around the world. Her Nesta publications are many. I'm just going to mention a few here. They include Collective Intelligence for Sustainable Development, Collective Crisis Intelligence for Frontline Humanitarian Response, Our Futures, By the People, For the People, Participatory AI for Humanitarian Innovation, and Combining Crowds and Machines. And the title of her talk today is Navigating Politics and Populism, Collective Intelligence for Climate Action. And we're really looking forward to hearing you speak. Thank you so much for coming to the IGP.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and really pleased to be here. So in our team, the Centre for Collective Intelligence Design, our mission is all about trying to create social impact, environmental impact, by harnessing the collective intelligence of large groups of people and combining that with the power of digital technologies. I'm not going to talk too much about what we do, although I'll give a couple of examples at the end. But I want to start with a question to all of you. So we're going to do something called a confidence ladder. I don't know if you've ever done a confidence ladder. It's a way of taking the temperature of the room. And the question is this: how confident do you feel about the ability of our political system to take the action that's needed on climate change? So if you are at very low levels of confidence, 0 levels of confidence, you're kind of down here on the confidence ladder. If you're kind of on the fence, you're at 50%, maybe you're at waist height. And if you're really confident that, you know, our current political system is going to nail this, no problem, you're at 100% here. So I'd like you to all stand up. And
is there anything below 0 that we can?
There is not. That's the floor of the ladder. Okay, so where is everyone? I think I'm about. Okay. Oh, it's looking like it's somewhat mixed, but the majority of you look like you're probably below 50%, which is perhaps not the best indicator of confidence. Thank you, everyone. That was really helpful. What I'm going to try and cover in the next 30-ish minutes is how we can strengthen our politics and our democracy to take bolder decisions on climate change. And in doing so, how we can start to tackle some of the causes of right-wing climate populism, and alongside all of that, create more inclusive climate policy and action. And specifically, I'll talk about how we can do that through harnessing new collective intelligence methods for involving the public right across the policy making cycle. And I'll illustrate what happens when you do that through a range of different examples from all over the world. Okay. You're probably thinking, but what is collective intelligence? Collective intelligence is actually a really simple idea. It's what happens when groups of people work together to share ideas, insights, data to solve a problem. It's what happens when a group of people become more than the sum of their parts. And of course, humans have been doing this for a very long time. But what has become more possible because of digital technologies is the ability to do this at much greater scale and in entirely new ways. And probably one of the most famous examples of collective intelligence is Wikipedia. I'm sure you've all used Wikipedia, but it's a great example of collective intelligence. It's millions of individual people building on each other's contributions to create an incredible repository of human knowledge. So collective intelligence is changing fields like how we produce knowledge. It's changing fields such as how we carry out scientific research through methods like citizen science, which I'll touch on a bit later. It's not yet changing how politics is done, but I believe it could. And I will talk about how I think it could in the next part of the presentation. But first, just wanted to touch briefly on the challenge that we're facing. And I probably don't need to tell any of you this because I'm sure you're all watching the news, reading the papers, and obviously seeing that populism is having an incredible resurgence all over the world. And of course, now we have, an overt populist back in charge again in the White House. And the key question is, why is it that populism is thriving at this particular point in time? What are the strategies and the tactics that populists are using? And what does this mean for climate change? So one of the key factors that enables populism to really thrive is increasing economic disadvantage. And of course, we've been seeing that everywhere. And what populists do is exploit legitimate grievances about job insecurity, rising costs of living, inequality, and they use that for their own advantage. One of the key things they do in relation to climate change particularly, and you'll have noticed this, is to frame and position it as an elite agenda that's really divorced from those everyday concerns around job security, cost of living, and potentially even harmful to them. That's a key strategy that they're using. And alongside that, they're using the tactics of undermining trust in evidence, undermining trust in expertise, and undermining trust in institutions. And the reason that these flames of populism are able to grow and be fanned is really because of a situation, not just in the UK, but right across the world, where we have seen declining trusts in government and in mainstream politics to really address people's fundamental concerns and the economic situations they find themselves in. So I think one of the keys to really tackling some of the causes of populism is to redress that trust deficit. Here in the UK, it's pretty clear that people feel that they don't have a politics that is working effectively for them. So 58% of the UK population in 2022 weren't confident that people like them have a say in what the UK government does. 36% weren't confident in their own ability to participate in politics. And in the last general election, only 52% of adults actually bothered to vote. And obviously, we've seen lots of stories recently about rising support for authoritarianism among young people, increasing support for the Reform Party. The latest polling showed that around 24% of the population were considering voting for reform, who are now running adverts everywhere saying they'll get rid of the net zero targets. And the last government obviously had an increasingly overt populist agenda, with the rolling back of targets for banning gas boilers and petrol cars, as well as MPs who were actively promoting theories around 15-minute cities. We have controversies as well around low traffic neighbourhoods and units. So there is very little trust amongst the UK population in our current mainstream politics. What does this mean for net zero? So the UK has actually done stunningly well on progress towards net zero targets to date. But one of the main reasons for this is because it's done it by doing things like decarbonising the energy grid, which doesn't really impact on most people and their lives. But to now get to achieve those net zero targets, you actually have to start doing things that require much wider societal and behaviour change. So changing how we travel, the food we eat, and changing how we heat our homes. So the Climate Change Committee have estimated that the percentage of carbon emissions that need to come from these types of behaviour and societal changes needs to rise from 13% to 59% between 2020 and 2035. So this is the stuff that people feel, experience, and have views on. So being able to do that in a way that brings the public along with those changes is increasingly important. However, at the same time, we know that understanding of net zero, it's increased a little, but it's still really low. While people think, 48% of people think that net zero will result in higher living costs. And it's not surprising that we have this vacuum of understanding, because since the legislation was introduced in 2019, there has been no large-scale coordinated public engagement campaign to communicate or to engage the public in really understanding what are the different potential pathways to get to net zero, and what are the different ways that this can be done in a way that's equitable, fair, and practical for the majority of people. And into that vacuum, misinformation has been able to spread, and populism has been able to start to grow. In 2023, our team did a poll of the public and found that 73% wanted to have a say in how the transition happened to net zero, but only 12% thought that the government was doing a good job of it. I'm interested in who those 12% are. Obviously that was under the last government, but I'd be really surprised if those figures have changed in any significant way since then. And I think fundamentally we have the problem that if people are feeling like politics is being done to them, then there's a high chance we are just continuing to create the conditions for populism to thrive, and we're increasing the chances of those net zero targets being missed. So I think to tackle the underlying causes of populism, we need to start to rebuild that trust in politics, policy, and government. And I think the key to doing this is to have much wider, much more widespread, much more meaningful participation in climate policy making and decision making. So that means opening up policy making to a much wider range of people. It means growing the scale of participation. So we work a lot with local councils, and at the moment they really struggle to get tens of people to come to a meeting about the changes they might be making in their local area. And even the UK's flagship climate assembly only had 100 people. I think what's really needed to tackle this mistrust is to be involving hundreds of thousands of people, if not more. But we also need to improve the quality of public participation, because at the moment we've got a very limited range of tools in the toolbox. There's a over-reliance on things like surveys, which are pretty dull, focus groups, and town hall meetings, which frankly, many people want to spend their evenings in a town hall meeting. So we really need to expand the toolbox of approaches. And this is where collective intelligence methods come in, because there's a huge, diverse range of different methods that use innovative digital tools and that could be used to engage the public in ways that are much more engaging, more accessible, and also more meaningful. And I'll talk about those in a while. The other big problem we have with participation at the moment is that it tends to happen right at the end of the policy making cycle, when all the key decisions have been made, and it feels like a tick box exercise, often because it is. So it's an institution just ticking their statutory duty, rather than really wanting to know what the public thinks and wants. So we need to bring participation much earlier in the policy cycle, where there is a genuine space for people to shape what is happening. And then finally, you'll probably all have experienced that frustration where maybe you did take part in a survey or you did attend a town hall meeting and nothing's changed as a result. And this is another absolutely critical part of building trust, because unless there is a much clearer accountability for connecting public views into policy outcomes, you actually can do a huge amount of damage. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the policymaking cycle. Broken it down into 7 different stages. I'll talk through each of the different stages, very briefly explain why I believe there's value in engaging the public at each stage, and then give an example of how this has been done in practice from somewhere else in the world. So the first stage of the policy cycle is setting the policy agenda. So this is where you will typically determine the issue that you're focusing on or the question that you might have. Now, the benefit of involving the public at this stage is pretty obvious. It's about ensuring that that policy agenda, the issue or the question you're asking, is actually aligned with things that feel relevant to people's needs and lives. One of the collective intelligence methods that is potentially really useful at that point in the policy making cycle is something called a deliberative mini public. I'm assuming that some of you might have heard of things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' panels, where you have a representative sample of the public who typically will deliberate and discuss around a particular set of issues together and make some recommendations. So the example here is from the German-speaking part of Belgium, where they've introduced a democratic innovation that's called the Ostbelgian model. What they've done is set up a permanent citizens' council. This is made up of 24 randomly selected members of the public, and they are given an 18-month term on this council. And the council has the responsibility for determining the policy agenda and the specific issues of a series of ad hoc citizens' assemblies or citizens' panels. Now, what's obviously exciting and innovative about that is you have members of the public shaping the policy agenda rather than politicians or rather than kind of specific interest groups. And any member of the public can ask the Citizens' Council to propose specific topics. The citizens' assemblies or citizens' panels will then make recommendations to the regional parliament, and it's then the role of the Citizens' Council to follow up, to check what's happened, making sure that those citizens' recommendations have been followed through. The next stage in the policy making cycle is about generating data and evidence so that you have a much better understanding of the issue that you're dealing with. Obviously, data in lots of parts of the world is quite patchy. Even in the UK, there are huge data gaps on lots of different issues. And one of the benefits of involving the public in this process is that you can generate and capture data that's much more granular, or data that's based on people's real lived experience. One of the collective intelligence methods that can be particularly useful here is a method called citizen science. Is anyone here involved in citizen science projects? Yeah, a couple of nods. Amazing. So for those of you who don't know, it's where volunteers will typically work with scientific researchers to generate new data or analyze data sets for scientific research. So it can be everything from identifying new stars in the galaxy through to counting birds in your back garden. So this project is a project from the US, Harlem, where scientists worked with disadvantaged communities in Harlem and trained them in how to use low-cost sensors to monitor the temperature and the humidity inside their homes during heat waves. Obviously, with climate change, heat waves are going to become more frequent and a much greater problem. The benefit here is that previously data that was relied on was satellite data, which gives you a sense of the kind of outdoor, the ground level temperatures, but doesn't tell you about the experiences and the effects inside people's homes. And this data was then used to inform policy decisions about where to locate cooling centres around the region, and also to help advocate for specific policy changes like electricity bill relief. The third stage in a policy cycle is where you get to proposing policy ideas. Typically, that's done by civil servants. Maybe it's done by lobbyists. Maybe it's done by charities who might be advocating to the government. The benefit of involving the public here is that you're actually able to generate much novel ideas, maybe ideas that wouldn't actually have occurred to civil servants or people who don't have that lived experience. An example of this is from Brazil. So they have something called the e-democracia platform. And essentially the method they use here is crowdsourcing. I'm sure you've all come across kind of crowdsourcing. And they use something called Wikilegis, which is a method for crowdsourcing ideas for legislation. So you can think of it as Wikipedia, but for writing laws. So one of the first uses for this was when they were producing a youth statute bill. And the final bill ended up having about 30% of its content based on the content that came through that crowdsourcing process with members of the public. And there were specific policies that got introduced into that bill that probably wouldn't have been thought up by policymakers. So things like reduced price travel for young people from disadvantaged families and free cultural tickets for those same low-income families. Okay, so you're now at the stage of the policy making cycle where perhaps you've got a range of different policy options. They've probably got some benefits, they've probably got some cons, and you need to weigh up the trade-offs. The benefit of involving the public at this point is it will help you understand how the public weighs up those different trade-offs. And it's particularly useful where you might have a highly controversial issue that is likely to cause potential public backlash. An example of a method you can use here is deliberative polling. So deliberative polling is a process where you typically bring together a representative sample of the population, you poll them to understand how they feel about an issue, then they have a chance to learn more about it, question experts, deliberate together, and at the end of the process, they're polled again. The example here is from South Korea, where the government used a deliberative polling process to help determine its nuclear energy strategy. So the specific question they had was whether to continue pausing construction of 2 new nuclear energy facilities or whether to resume their construction. So they brought together 500 randomly selected members of the public. They gave them access to experts, information, chance to deliberate together. It was broadcast on national TV, which must have made for interesting viewing. And at the end, 60% of the participants voted in favour of resuming the construction of these nuclear energy facilities. That is a very rare example of actually where the public has been involved in major decisions about energy transitions. Okay, so we're now at the making decision point in the policy making cycle. Typically, this is done by politicians. So lots of the other participatory processes will essentially provide recommendations, but the final decision still sits with the politicians. There's one collective intelligence method, however, that actually gives much more of that decision-making power directly to citizens, and that's participatory budgeting. You might have heard of this. It's been around a while. It came out of Brazil in the 1990s. Lisbon, though, was one of the first European cities to adopt it widely. So participatory budgeting is a process that typically involves the public in deciding how public money gets spent, often involving the public too in generating ideas for how that money could be spent, then allowing them to vote for the things that they want to have funded. Lisbon introduced their participatory budgeting in 2008. In 2019, they decided to make it entirely focused on the climate agenda and sustainability issues. And they typically allocate around €2.5 million to that participatory budgeting process every year. Okay, so we're now at the implementing solutions stage of the policy making cycle. And typically at this point, the public tends to be recipients of particular measures or users of new services. However, in an increasingly resource-constrained environment and in an increasingly complex world, there are real benefits to potentially involving the wider public in some of the solution delivery, solution implementation, because it enables the achievement of those goals, those solutions at a much greater scale. One of the methods that can be used for this that really enables that kind of collective action is the use of things like open source repositories and open source software. The example here is a project called Plant for the Planet. And what it does is allow anyone anywhere in the world who's running a tree restoration project, a tree planting initiative, to register their project, and then provides them with open source content and guidelines on how to do that really effectively. It also has open source software that allows them to verify and monitor their progress, as well as run funding campaigns through it. And this is a really nice example of how lots of small scale distributed actions can actually add up to a much larger, a much greater impact. Okay, so we're at the final stage of the policymaking cycle, and this is the one that typically gets forgotten. So by policymakers, by everyone, at best, maybe an evaluation will be commissioned several years after the policy has been introduced, if the government hasn't changed and people haven't moved on. By that point, it's typically too late to learn whether something really did work or not. There are two key benefits of involving the public at this particular point. So number one is by involving people in the real-time monitoring of policy impact, so you can understand whether it's really having the impact that you thought it would or not, so you can course correct much sooner. And the second is to hold institutions accountable and really ensuring that actually they are delivering on their goals and delivering on their commitments. The example I want to give here is from India. The method is very specific here. It's crowd labeling, but there's lots of different social accountability methods that are all different varieties of crowdsourcing. So the United Nations Development Programme in India recruited around 300 different volunteers and got them to label some satellite data that they had collected. So labeling satellite data is you are literally attaching tags to identify certain features within a data set. That data was then used to train a machine learning algorithm, which was able to detect the most polluting brick kilns across India. So those brick kilns that were flouting environmental regulations. That data was then given to the Indian government, who then took action against the most polluting brick kilns, closing them down. Okay, so I guess caveat to what I've just said. Number one, that's not an exhaustive list of methods. There are many others that you can use at different points in the cycle, and you do not need to necessarily have participation at every single point for every single policy. The key is to really be clear about why you might want to involve the public, what you're looking for, and to understand which method might help you best achieve that. But I think the key, they're obviously very disparate examples as well that I've shared from all around the world. Some of them are quite old now. So I want you to kind of just take a little bit of an imaginative leap and just imagine if we did have a much more concerted strategic effort to deploy some of these methods, just what that might do to public engagement and public trust in government. So I'm hoping there's a few of you here in the room to say, well, what's the evidence for all of this? And I want to be really honest with you that the evidence is not robust at all. So this is an area that really needs much, much more research. The theoretical foundations don't really exist, and there's the empirical evidence also doesn't really exist for participation as a direct counter to populism. However, there is patchy evidence, there's emerging evidence for the value of participatory approaches in doing some of these things. So there is some evidence that shows that these methods, ranging from participatory budgeting to citizen science to citizens' assemblies, can help reduce polarization amongst participants, that it can increase the perceptions of legitimacy of a particular policy and perceptions of legitimacy of the institution that has commissioned the process, that it can improve public understanding and awareness of issues, that it can also, when done well, reduce local opposition to specific changes, that it can lead to better and more inclusive policy, and that it can help demonstrate much bolder support for policy action than politicians typically expect there to be. I'm going to give a couple of very brief examples from our work in the last couple of years engaging the public on climate policy, first on net zero and secondly on climate adaptation. These are all from here in the UK. And hopefully I'll play you a short film about the first project, which is called The Strategy.
The strategy room is an immersive experience. It's a way for someone to walk in and off the street with no prior knowledge of climate change. And within about 90 minutes, they'll understand a whole range of net zero policies.
We wanted to create an innovative way for the public to explore and express their views. The strategy room combines deliberation, like you might get in a citizens' assembly, along with interactive polling.
It's about community consultation, it's about engagement with the tenants, residents. I think asking those questions again people to do differently.
These kind of meetings, there needs to be more of them to inspire people.
Very informative, very helpful, and also very enjoyable, to be honest.
It's a positive insight to what the future will be like.
So the strategy room was all about involving people in exploring different pathways, different policy options to get to net zero. We actually did it in partnership with UCL's Climate Action Lab and a creative design studio called Fast Familiar. We had 638 participants in our pilot across 12 different local council areas. Key thing here, we found there was really strong support for pretty much all of the net zero policies that we explored within the strategy room. The things that were consistently popular were the ideas of sustainable local food sourcing within public services and community energy schemes. We did not see any statistically significant difference by age or by gender, or even by cultural values set. However, we did see statistically significant differences between people in different local areas. And I think the key takeout here is that there is no one size fits all when it comes to net zero policies for different areas. And it really highlights the importance and the need to do local engagement and not rely on things like national polling as a guide to what will work in any one particular area. Another key outcome, we saw a very strong relationship between people's satisfaction with the outcome of their group and their perception of the quality of the deliberation that the group had. And I think there's something really interesting here for anyone who's working in public engagement and policy to really think about the outcome that you're looking for and the method that you use, because this does indicate that potentially people will feel more positive about their experience if they've had a really good chance to discuss and deliberate with other people. However, the majority of kind of gauging kind of public opinion is still your classic YouGov poll. So we wanted to compare our sample to a YouGov poll of 2,000 people around the country. The yellow bars here are the most important things to look at. We found that within our sample, on average, people were 12% more positive about the net zero policies than they were in the YouGov poll. However, big caveat here, the samples do not directly compare. So again, this is an area where we need much more research to understand whether this was caused by sample bias or whether to what extent this could be caused by having more engaging, more participatory approaches to asking people about policy preferences. This is a super short example. This was a project we ran last year with Southend and Thurrock councils called the Situation Room. You can see we have a theme with how we name things. And this was all about engagement on different adaptation strategies at a local level, covering water scarcity, coastal erosion, flooding. I won't go too much into the method, but I think the key thing here is we saw people's view shift. From the start of the conversation to the end of the conversation, here you can see where they were exploring inland flooding. They became much more positive about some of the nature-based solutions, approaches to tackling flooding than they did towards some of the engineered concrete infrastructure. And I think the key takeout here is people's views aren't necessarily fixed. There is still some flexibility for people to change their opinions, and it's one of the reasons why engagement that actually gives people the space to do that is so important. I started off by talking about trust. I want to highlight this in particular. We saw an 8% increase in trust in the council to do the right thing on climate change from the start to the end of the session on average. And bear in mind that each session was only about 90 minutes to 2 hours long. That I think is quite a hopeful statistic. We also found people really loved taking part. They wanted to do more. They even wanted to volunteer. So I think, again, in contrast to the disillusionment that people feel towards national politics and mainstream politics and government, there is still, I think, huge potential, huge hope that we can definitely tap into if we create the right conditions and the right opportunities for people to do that. Just to end on one final quote. So, and I think this is really important for governments everywhere. If governments want to be trusted, they also have to give trust. This is a quote from Audrey Tang, who's the former digital minister of Taiwan. And the quote is, "It's not about us, the government asking for trust, it's about us radically trusting citizens."
Thank you so much. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to start us off with one or two, and then we're going to open the floor. But I want to begin by going back to the notion of disillusionment. And you have spoken quite a bit about disillusionment with government. But I want to ask you about disillusionment with the other. Because it seems to me that nowadays everybody has grievances, regardless of what their position in society is, regardless of considerations such as, gender, ethnicity, class, and regardless of their political ideologies. Everybody also thinks, it seems to me, and correct me here if I'm wrong, but everybody seems to be thinking that there's a takeover by the other, right? So left-wing people are very concerned about the growth of right-wing ideas and people pushing right-wing ideas in government, in different kinds of institutions. Right-wing people are really paranoid about left-wing people taking over institutions. They're very critical of climate change as an elitist agenda, EDI policies, all kinds of a whole series of issues. And one thing that I think is happening is everybody is dismissing the other's grievances as a fantasy and seeing their own grievances as legitimate. And I think that puts us in a very difficult position, because if you are unable to even acknowledge that somebody's grievance is legitimate, how do you build trust and create a sort of a political culture that works, right? So I wanted to start us off with that and hear your view on that topic.
Wow. Okay, that's a big one. That's on the one hand, I think politics is always a battle of ideas. Okay, it's the principle of democracy is that often one set of ideas wins over the other, and the other one that has lost has to accept that they've lost.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental principle of democracy. I think in terms of whether there's increasing inability of people to understand other views and grievances, I think there's a couple of things that maybe are contributing to that. So probably the fragmentation of the information ecosystem is obviously critical. And I think probably the lack of spaces for people to be able to share and talk. I think, we're seeing the breakdown of lots of institutions, which in the past might have brought more diverse groups of people together to be able to understand where there is commonality. However, on the flip side, I think there's this consistently polling by organisations like More in Common that show that actually the differences aren't as big as people think they are. So I feel slightly uncertain about all of this, but I think we do need more spaces for people to be able to meet people who aren't like them. Yeah. That's consistently the feedback that we get when we run these kind of events, that people love being able to hear from people who aren't like them and who they don't normally interact with in public life. So I think creating more of those spaces is really important. And also thinking about how we design things like our social media platforms so that we have access to that diversity of perspectives and not just people who think exactly like us or share our views.
I mean, when I was listening to your response, I was thinking that we're interacting much more often with algorithms than we're interacting with other people, aren't we? And I think if information is mediated by algorithms designed to capture our attention and provoke certain kinds of emotions that keep us going, that's probably a very significant contributing factor, because nobody is going to click on something that says, oh, like things are actually fairly normal. There are people who sort of disagree, but we can work out our agreements. People tend to click on things that are outrageous, create a sort of sense of outrage, and that itself creates a kind of sense of imagined community, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because they feel that they're part of a collective that is fighting this other. But in reality, if you meet people in public spaces, that emotional relation to the other is very different than in the phantasmatic space of social media representation.
Exactly. And one of the other pieces of work that we have, or streams of work, is around participation in AI. And this is another area where we do need definitely a lot more democratic participation engagement, because the decisions about things like what the algorithm is optimizing for are currently made by typically very small groups of white, wealthy men in the US, often. And those incentives are often quite perverse incentives. I was on a panel earlier this week with a woman from Sudan who was explaining about the impact of the changes in the Facebook algorithm. It's now optimized for things that have been most shared, whereas historically the feed was chronological. And she said that's had huge impacts on the ability of people in Sudan to provide mutual aid and support. And you can guarantee that no one in Meta, when they were making that change, had thought what implication it could have for those people in Sudan. And that's one of the key reasons why we need much more inclusion in things like AI and technologies.
Yeah. All right, let's open the floor to questions. So we have one here first, then Errol and
Thanks. It's kind of like part one and part two. I wonder, with regards to climate change specifically, the extent to which is a participatory issue versus just I don't know, better climate change education. And I say this because with climate change, we know that it's complex and technical and we'll go into that, but it's different from, say, you know, sexual orientation or religious views, where it's a lot more socially ontological in nature versus climate. And so I wonder, and this leads to kind of the second question on the quality of participation, because then you're not just asking people what they think, you're kind of expecting them to be brought to a certain level of standard of knowledge of what is good, a good solution, right? Unless, so I guess the way I would phrase it is, you're not asking them to pick between, are you asking them to pick between, say, nature-based solution 1 versus nature-based solution 2? Or you're kind of asking them to pick, is a nature-based solution better than the food-based policy or whatever? And so in comparing apples to oranges, that's, yeah, kind of is a bit more technical than that, right? So I am wondering the extent to which it's a participatory issue versus just other things. And conversely then, because I know Nesta does a lot of other research, is there anything else beyond climate change that would benefit from a participatory process more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer each question in turn?
What do you prefer?
I'll give it a go. I'll try and keep it short. I'm conscious of time. Okay. Is it a matter of education? Yes, I think there's a huge amount of work to do to help climate science be translated into things that people can easily understand. I think the onus needs to be on the organisations that have the resources to be able to communicate what they're doing in a way that makes it accessible and relatable. Is it just a technocratic issue? No, I don't think it absolutely is. This is fundamental decisions about how we change society. Yes, there is a role for experts to advise and guide, but no, we absolutely need the public to be involved in making these decisions, because if you do not involve the public in making these decisions, they will either react against them, and where particularly it relates to things like adoptions of new behaviours, like switching modes of travel, switching how you heat your home, people will not adopt those new behaviours if they have not been brought along with the process. And that's some of the biggest pushbacks that we're seeing right now.
Thank you. I completely agree with the need to engage, but I'm struggling with the same thing with my research on conspiracy theories. I was going to, because when people participate, because I'm generally working with like more radical right conspiratorial groups, and then in anthropological circles we have this kind of collaborative mentality. But when you give voice to radical right, what happens is a question in my mind. And in this case, anti-climatic climate activists, imagine, or people who do not, in Germany, for instance, think of the people who are rebelling against like the boilers, no?
Yeah.
And then what happens when the chunk of this population is integrated into your participatory culture? And related to this, do we assume then, like me actually, that when people know the truth per se, if there is such thing, then they will change their behavior and mind? And what happens even when we show them and then they don't change? What's the safeguard mechanism, or is there?
Yeah. Oh, okay, there's tons of questions in that. So do people always change their mind in response to new information? No, is the answer. I think there's quite a lot of research around that. There's also some research in a Dutch context actually around citizens' assemblies. There was some evidence that it reduced populist views by being parts of that, but it's not clear exactly what caused that, whether it was exposure to the evidence, whether it was about the process. It's slightly unclear. I think you'll probably know better than me, but with misinformation, my understanding is that actually directly debunking the misinformation doesn't work at all. I think there's a key thing that maybe cuts across both of your questions actually, which hasn't come up, which is about the role of identity informing people's beliefs and values. And actually, I think there's a growing body of research now that people's identities are formed first and their beliefs tend to follow the beliefs of the group which they associate themselves. And a key part of what populism is increasingly doing is giving people a sense of belonging to a group.
So I have a question over there, and then over here.
Thank you. I'm from Taiwan, so it's very nice to see all the going on there. But I have two questions, and The first one is like, what do you think is the effective incentives for participation, like in these deliberations? Because you're pulling people out of their normal lives and routines, and so there must be some kind of incentives, I guess. And the second one is what do you think is just a selection criteria? Because I imagine like there's might be this kind of trade-off of quality of the results and but the value of democracy, like equal participation. So how do you manage these like trade-offs?
Great question. So incentives for participation. Typically, with a lot of these processes, you'll tend to remunerate people for taking part. And I really think it's important. You can't expect people to be able to give up evenings, weekends, without some form of remuneration, because otherwise only people who have the means to be able to participate would. So that's really key. But I think there's quite a lot of evidence from the citizen science field now that actually says that financial incentives are not the only incentives, that actually people often participate for other reasons. One, making a contribution, two, gaining new skills, and three, actually meeting other people. So I think there are lots of different kind of incentives that you can potentially draw on. In terms of selection criteria, again, there's like a whole variety of different approaches to selection for participatory methods, and they range from being completely open to anyone who wants to take part through to things like sortition, where you will have a very statistical approach of trying to get a sample that is as statistically representative of the population as it can be. And I think you have to, again, it comes back to what you're trying to achieve, what method you're using, as to which recruitment or selection criteria you might choose for a particular project.
We need to be leaving imminently,
Okay.
but there's still some questions in the room, so maybe we could just do super quick.
Yep.
Get people to ask questions and then, a 30-second
Mhm.
response if you're
Okay.
able. So there was one over here and one over there very quickly in 20 seconds, and then one over here.
My question is around the stages that you shared with policymaking. And you said a very critical sentence really, that you don't have to more public in some of the stages. Which stages did you say you don't have to be more public?
Yeah. So he actually asked my question about selection criteria, but my tangent is a bit more on the facilitation of the discussion, because I think there's a body of research that says that for collective intelligence to thrive, we need pure decentralized systems. I wonder, from the perspective of an organizer, how involved we should be in terms of facilitating the discussion.
And then final question over here.
Yeah, how do we increase and build trust in a time that is so uncertain and doesn't trust in technology and AI?
35 seconds.
Oh my gosh, okay. Which stages can you skip? It totally depends what you're trying to achieve, what the policy is. Sorry, it's one of those it depends answers. So you have to be really clear what it is you're trying to achieve, and then you can figure out at what stage you might want to involve people or not. In terms of facilitation, does it need to be decentralized or not? I think there's a spectrum of participation, and it goes from, at one level where you are literally informing people about what's happening, through to co-designing things with them. Again, which is right? I would prefer that more things were more towards the empowering end of the scale, but again, the answer is it depends what you're trying to achieve. And then how to build trust in a time of uncertainty. I wish I had the answer.
Citizen science. Citizen science, no?
Citizen science, I think, is one of the different methods that you can use to start to do that.
Thank you so much.